For example, if I say the rosary, I will pause during something that touches me particularly on this mystery, in an event in my own personal life. And I reflect on the deeper meaning of the mystery. I don't even have to finish the Hail Mary prayer. God the Father tells this to St. Catherine of Siena. He says, when you are praying and I visit you during your discursive prayer, stop the discursive prayer and focus on my visitation to you through inspiration in this moment. This is how you grow spiritually. He says the only prayer you should not stop when I come to you.
Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name.
Thanks again for tuning in to Everything Catholic, and as always, I hope all of you are going to learn a lot from our lesson together this time as well. So, this is going to be one long answer from Father Joseph Iannuzzi to a question I asked him during our Zoom session recently, and I asked him about unceasing prayers. I know it's quite long, but I can assure you, by the end of this, you're going to learn so much from this one. Listen to this.
Well, I'll address unceasing prayer. Now, in his letter to the Romans, St. Paul instructs Christians, in quotes, to be constant in prayer. This comes from Romans 12:12. And in his first letter to the Thessalonians, he says simply, pray without ceasing. This is 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 17. Now, these two commands of the Apostle Paul have been interpreted in the Eastern tradition and the Western in different ways. First, the Eastern tradition. Unceasing prayer is understood in two ways. The search for active unceasing prayer has its source not only in Jesus' exhortation to the apostles, where he also told them to stay awake, right, in the Garden of Gethsemane to pray, but also it's found in the Song of Songs, chapter 5, verse 2, where it says, I slept, but my heart was awake. In the psalmist, who says, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continuously be in my mouth. All these biblical passages refer to a form of unceasing prayer. Now, in the East, the first method of unceasing prayer is, I would refer you to the writings of St. John Chrysostom, who relates that Christians should have regular times for prayer in which they pray and never skip these moments. He says, in the evening and in the morning and at noonday. And this is inspired by Psalm 55, verse 17. And in between these prayer times, St. John Chrysostom adds, one should always remember God and do all things to his glory. This is also inspired by 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31, where we offer up supplications and petitions as the need may arise, and praising and thanking God when the occasion requires it. Such is the normal way that all Christians must live according to St. John Chrysostom. And St. John the Latter, who has a series of steps of praying, step number 28, in this step he states, prepare for your set times of prayer by unceasing prayer in your soul, and you will soon make progress. This is again St. John the Latter. So the saints in the Eastern Church had this approach, in particular the writings of John Chrysostom, St. John the Latter. We also find it in the writings of St. Dimitri of Rostov, who said that all beginners, no matter how advanced we think they are, ought never go back and repeat prayers poorly done. The saints remind us to put ourselves at the mercy of God and try to do better the next time. And this method reduces the possibility of thinking that God hears our prayers according to the perfection of our performance and not according to the greatness of our love with which we pray and of his mercy that accompanies them. And it safeguards us against both pride and despair. So we also find in the East exhortations, for example, from Theophane, the recluse from the 19th century, in The Art of Prayer, his work. And it's often this unceasing prayer necessarily, but not often connected with one's breathing. It's often, but not necessarily connected with one's breathing, so much so that it is uttered with every breath, according to St. Gregory the theologian and St. John Chrysostom. They considered breathing a form of prayer. In fact, if you go back to the Old Testament and you look up the original enunciation of the word God, which is Yahweh, the original Hebrew Bible, before the Masoretic Old Testament scripture was codified and considered the standard form of the Old Testament Hebrew, we find that Yahweh had no vowels. Yahweh, Yahweh. Now, the Old Testament enunciation, when the Israelites would go into battle, they would scream Yahweh, Yahweh, Yahweh. That articulation of Yahweh, Yah, Ho, is the sound you make when you breathe. Yah and Ho. Ho. So inhalation is Yah and exhalation is Ho. So therefore, St. John Chrysostom, St. Gregory the theologian considered breathing the calling upon the name of God, and therefore a form of prayer, and therefore unceasing prayer, because we unceasingly breathe. And it begins with a vocal petition, becomes almost silently with the lips enunciated, and then it becomes wholly mental, without even the articulation of lips. And the claim is made that one can continue this unceasing prayer while even engaged in the normal activities of life, while reading and writing, and even while sleeping. Thus the body sleeps, but the heart is awake, as I mentioned in the Song of Songs. And then, whenever one's attention to the affairs of life cease, or when one awakes from one's bed, one finds that the prayer is continuing itself. Prayer is also known to break through one's consciousness with power in times of temptation or stress, as it were, of its own accord. In the writing of a superior of a community, Igumen Chariton, in the art of prayer, we find this. We also find, while the body may be tempted or tired, the spirit may unceasingly come to the aid of the body. Evagrius, an Eastern mystical writer, affirmed, in quotes, "We are not commanded to work, keep vigil, or fast without ceasing, but we are commanded to pray without ceasing. For prayer purifies and strengthens the mind, which was created to pray and to fight the demons for the protection of all the powers of the soul," unquote. So this Evagrius of Pontius of the 4th century, mystical writer, makes this statement. So does Gregory Palamas, a 14th century Eastern writer and considered a mystic and philosopher by Pope John Paul II, who reveals how all Christians in general must pray without ceasing. He states, in quotes, again, St. Gregory Palamas, "No, let no one think, my brother Christians, that it is the duty only of priests and monks to pray without ceasing, and not of laymen and women. No, no, it is the duty of all Christians to remain always in prayer. Bear in mind the method of prayer, how it is possible to pray without ceasing, namely, by praying in the mind. And this we can do always if we wish. For when we sit down to work with our hands, when we walk, when we eat, when we drink, we can always pray mentally and practice this mental prayer, the true prayer pleasing to God. Blessed are those who acquire this heavenly habit, for by it they overcome every temptation," unquote. Now that's the Eastern approach to unceasing prayer. Then we have the Western tradition, which really concurs with the Eastern tradition as well, that set times of prayer are very important and should not be put aside without due reason, even when one prays continuously in his heart. Each person desiring to live the spiritual life should have his own rule of prayer. It should be brief and regular, such that it could be kept in all conditions and circumstances. In this set rule of prayer, the prayers of the church should be used. The Lord's Prayer, for example, and the church's devotional prayers that come to us by way of the magisterium or the saints, like the Stations of the Cross, the Rosary, the Chaplet of Divine Mercy, the Hours of the Passion of Picaretta, St. Bridget prayers, the prayers accompanying the First Friday and Saturday devotions, and so forth. So by establishing a daily rule of prayer, one instills discipline and provides instruction and inspiration. And the saints, as I mentioned, demonstrated that a person who does not follow a set rule of prayers may be impoverish his soul, and reduces prayer to the limited perspective of his own individual desires and needs. In other words, I only say prayers when I'm in need of help. And this really impoverishes the soul. I remember Jesus telling the servant of God, Luisa Picaretta, several of whose works are officially approved by the magisterium and whose cause for canonization is moving forward. In volume 1, subtitle 15, Jesus tells Luisa, in order to combat the devil and the demons, whom he allowed to test her, like he allowed the demons to test his son in the desert, what I ask of you is steadfast prayer. Even if you should suffer the pains of death at the hands of the demons, you must never neglect your daily prayers, that which you are accustomed to do. So Louisa's routine of daily prayers and pious exercises, up when Jesus told her this in her early 20s, included meditating on the infant Jesus in his blessed mother's womb in preparation for Christmas. And in the house of Nazareth, she would meditate upon the virtues of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. With her mind's eye, her imagination, she would contemplate, beholding God in all things throughout creation while doing her rounds, placing an I love you to God in every created thing that God made for love of us, in order to requite God's loving creation. And she did this because Jesus told her that since only man has a voice in which to articulate a rational language, he is to be the voice of all mute creation. Therefore, all irrational beings stand in attention, waiting for us to voice our praise on their behalf to God. This is known as Louisa's rounds in creation, glorifying God in and through all things. She would also include in her daily pious exercises and prayers acts of humility, of self-abasement, frequent sacramental confession, acts of gratitude, of charity, spirit of sacrifice, compliance to the teachings of the church. I mentioned already meditation on Jesus' passion. And she would do interiorly 33 visits to Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament to offer him reparation wherever she was. She would bilocate, so to speak, her soul, not her body, and before the Blessed Sacrament prostrate herself spiritually and offer him reparation. And she would also do at the beginning of every day her morning offering in the divine will known as the prevenient act. And she would renew that throughout the day known as the actual act, etc. So when praying with a set rule of prayer, the Western tradition tells us to put our whole mind and heart into the meanings of the words we recite. Now, there are two types of prayer according to the Western tradition. In particular, in the writings of St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, there is discursive and contemplative prayer. The discursive is with the mouth, where we speak out loud, where we articulate the words, where we focus on the words. Contemplative is where you don't really speak at all. The mind is engaged, the heart is engaged. The emphasis is off the articulation and on the meaning underlying the words. You're penetrating the spirit of those words. And you're allowing the Spirit of God to guide your human spirit. So the spiritual doctors, masters of the church, tell us that when we read or pray, we follow, on the one hand, a certain rule of prayers every day, but we're not merely saying or reciting the prayers, which is really not a prayer at all, but genuinely praying through personal attention and fervor. So every prayer we articulate with the mouth or with the mind must always be accompanied by love, fervor, attention, devotion, zeal, ardent love. We must allow our mind not to wander from the words of the prayer. And if we do, we should not worry or be flustered about it. St. Teresa of Avila told one of her sisters to treat distractions during prayer as one would nonchalantly treat a distracted fly that's buzzing around you. You swat it and continue on. And if it returns, you swat it and you continue on. St. Bernard affirmed that distraction should not be a cause of anxiety, but one should attempt to remove them peacefully. And other Western saints and church doctors tell us that we should use the given words that we recite as the basis for our personal devotion, allowing the mind to go beyond the words to images, impressions within the soul that are without words, in a prayer of silence and contemplative union. This is how the Lord leads us. We progress from discursive to contemplative prayer. For example, if I say the rosary, I will pause during something that touches me, particularly on this mystery, in an event in my own personal life. And I reflect on the deeper meaning of the mystery. I don't even have to finish the Hail Mary prayer. God the Father tells this to St. Catherine of Siena. He says, when you are praying and I visit you during your discursive prayer, stop the discursive prayer and focus on my visitation to you through inspiration in this moment. This is how you grow spiritually. He says the only prayer you should not stop when I come to you is the Mass and the breviary, the office of readings that the priests and the religious are bound to recite. Though he tells her this, he tells Catherine of Siena this. You don't interrupt the Mass, you don't interrupt the breviary, the prayer of the church, but you should interrupt every other paraliturgical prayer when I come to you, even the rosary. Because why? The rosary disposes us and leads us to contemplative union. So do the Stations of the Cross, so do the Divine Mercy Chaplet, so do all the other private devotions we have. They're not an end in themselves, they're a means to an end, and the end is contemplative union with God. So when the contemplative union joins us, we stop the discursive prayer in that moment. And then we let God in the Spirit absorb our intellect, our memory, our will. And that's how God leads us into deeper intimacy and union with the Trinity. Saint Dmitri of Rostov, I mentioned him earlier in the Eastern tradition. I'm now speaking of the Western, I finished the Eastern, but going back momentarily to Saint Dmitri of Rostov, he affirms that we are all beginners no matter how advanced we think we are. And that we ought to never go back and repeat prayers poorly done. Now, why does he say this? Because not only does he remind us, but also the saints of the East and West alike remind us that this method of not going back and try to improve our prayer reduces the possibility of thinking that God hears our prayers according to the perfection of our performance. He does not judge us according to our performance, but according to the greatness of our love with which we pray. And this is oftentimes why the Mass is not rendered invalid when a senior priest, due to, let's say, his mind slipping due to old age, the lack of the cholesterol in the brain. The brain is formed mostly of cholesterol, and that gray matter deteriorates as we age. And therefore, the neuropses, the synapses, don't always have that connectivity that they had when they were younger. I use this analogy of a brain, and as we get old, what happens to it? The gray matter. It begins to deplete in all of us as we age. That gray matter may be analogously likened to the rubber coating on a telephone wire that you see connecting one telephone pole to the next. When we speak on the phone, I mean a phone, like back in the 60s when I grew up, we had a phone on the wall and it had a wire, it had like a curly little wire attaching the wall phone to the hand receiver. And that wire went into the wall of the house, underground, then it went up through the antenna and was connected above the roof to a telephone pole. And to this day, you still see these telephone wires connecting one pole to the next. All these wires are connected by a rubber-coated cable. That's the gray matter in your brain. If that coating of that telephone cable is removed, the voice cannot be conveyed from one telephone wire to the next or one phone to the next. It disappears into cyberspace. That coating is like your brain. As it depletes, the information gets lost. Now, of course, there's a doctor who put out a book on how to improve the gray matter in the brain and reduce dementia, Alzheimer's. It's called, let me think, I read this like 20 years ago. It was called Megadosing with Omega. I think that was the title. The doctor is Dr. Barry Sears. And he really pushes omega-3 fish oil as one of the best things for the brain. But getting back to the point, when we are distracted, like a senior priest is saying the Mass, let's suppose he forgets, he mixes up the consecration prayers. People hear that, they say, oh, the consecration's invalid because he didn't say the exact words that are prescribed by the church for the Eucharist to be validly consecrated. Is it an invalid consecration? No, not if. And here's the caveat. If that senior priest before the Mass made an explicit intention, every priest is before the Mass to say a prayer, two prayers actually, one to the Blessed Mother and one to God, that his Mass he intends to say and consecrate validly the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. And then he asks Mary to accompany him. Let's suppose he does that prayer before the Mass. He sets his intention. God sees that. Then during the Eucharistic prayer, because of his lack of mental acuity, he slips. He misses one or two words. It's still valid because God sees the intention. He's not locked into the literary word, even though the priest's intention is to recite those exact words. But unintentionally, he muffs the word. It's still valid. So what is my point in all this? We should not focus on only the words and be locked into discursive prayer all the time because we don't advance to contemplative prayer. And if we do something poorly done, we don't have to rush back and redo the whole thing. Now, it is true, on the other hand, that God trained some of his saints by repeating the Our Father prayer in order to train them how to say it properly. So did the Blessed Mother Agata Bandal. And this is not making them repeat it to focus on the word, but to help them focus on the spirit underlying the word. See? So the saints remind us that this method of relying upon God's mercy and focusing on the love in the prayer, not so much on every little articulation of the word, enables us to progress from discursive to contemplative prayer and to pray continuously, unceasingly, because unceasing prayer is a contemplative prayer of the mind, not of the mouth. And it safeguards us from both pride and despair. It gives us humility and hope and keeps us always forging ahead. Okay. Oh, one more thing. On contemplative prayer, I wish to add also the addition of a work that bears the official magisterial seals of approval, namely the imprimaturs and the nihil obstats. This work, True Life in God, bears multiple imprimaturs, multiple nihil obstats, and I did a theological review available to the public on these ecclesially approved prophetic revelations. And in it, the woman receiving these messages says, Lord, Lord. Jesus, tells her, Lord, whoever says, Lord, Lord, does not go to heaven, but whoever does the will of God. Okay? And then she asks Jesus, but how can we progress in love? How can I pray without ceasing? This is not possible, to pray without ceasing. To leave my duties of the house, it is impossible. And Jesus tells her, in these True Life in God approved messages, to pray without ceasing does not mean that I want you on your knees 24 hours per day. To pray without ceasing is a prayer without words. It is called a silent prayer. It is a contemplative prayer. It is when your heart desires God all day long. It is when your heart thirsts for God all day long. It is when you live perpetually in God and God lives perpetually in you, living in his will. This is prayer without ceasing.
And I also asked him, after all that on unceasing prayers, is this related to the virtue of simplicity? Which I've shared with you recently, by the way, the virtue of simplicity. Listen to this.
The Blessed Mother was a master of simplicity inasmuch as she, without performing any external prodigies, miracles, without calling any attention to herself, even from those closest to her, who suspected nothing of her holiness, was able to surpass all the angels and saints in holiness combined. Jesus reveals this to the servant of God, Louisa, that the Blessed Mother surpassed in holiness all the angels and all the saints of all times combined, and yet no one around her suspected it. This is her being a master of simplicity. Simplicity means You fulfill your obligations as a Christian to the letter, to perfection, with perfect love, while at the same time doing everyone else does externally, so whereby no one suspects you're any different from them. And you can do unceasing prayer with this perfection of simplicity as well. No, see, this is the beauty of the saints. They were able to be holy without calling attention to themselves. That's true Christian holiness. Jesus says, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Don't be like the publican standing in the square and letting everyone see you pray, fasting and distorting your face so everyone knows you're fasting. Everything must be done in hiddenness, in concealment, in silence. This is true Christian holiness. You know, I'm glad you asked this because I've been giving retreats for over 30 years throughout all the continents of the world. And I don't say this to any merit of mine. I say it to the merit of people who pray for me and to the merit of God's grace and the Blessed Mother, of course, whom I attribute my vocation to at Medjugorje when I went there in 88 and received my vocation as a priest. And many people that I meet during my travels think that holiness must be noticeable. And they're completely wrong. If you're truly holy, nobody will notice it. They may say, yes, I could see on the outside that this person behaves in a virtuous manner, but that's as far as they go. Virtue doesn't mean you're necessarily holy, because even the devil, St. Faustinus states, can feign holiness. He can appear to be holy and pious, but on the inside he could be evil. St. Paul says that Satan can appear as an angel of light. That's how clever he is. But the only virtue Satan cannot mimic or mask, St. Faustina says, is the virtue of obedience. He can pretend to be pious. He can attack the Pope saying, I'm doing this to defend the true faith and holiness. He can pretend that he's being pious by exemplifying on the outside all the piousness people expect of a pious person. But we don't see what's on the inside. Only God sees that, okay? That's right. Jesus tells the servant of God, Luisa Picaretta, in volume 2, on August 10th, 1889, that fire will strike evildoers, and we know the fire is coming very soon, that Peter talks about in his second letter, but those who are good and live a life of simplicity will be spared of this fire. Again, volume 2, August 10th, 1899. Because the virtue of simplicity aids not only in filling the soul with grace, but in diffusing grace into others naturally. Jesus tells this to Louisa in volume 7, October 3rd, 1906. He says, my daughter, simplicity fills the soul with grace to the point of overflowing. So if one wanted to constrain grace within himself, it could not be done. Just as the Spirit of God, because he is most simple, diffuses everywhere without effort or strain, but rather naturally, so the soul who possesses the virtue of simplicity diffuses grace into others without even realizing it.
Well then, that will be all for the video this time. And as always, thank you so much for taking the time to be here again, and hopefully all of you have learned a lot from this video. Remember, if there's any feedback or suggestion, please let us know in the comments below. Anyway, if you like what we do and you'd like to support us, I left a link to our PayPal donation in the description box below and from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much for your continuous support, contributions, and prayers. And until the next one, thanks again for watching and may God bless you.
Man, I don't know who they think I am. I make minimum wage over here, man. I ain't dying for this.